Lauren Johnson, welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. I felt like you were destined to be on this show. We both love mental performance. This was meant to happen today. Thanks for joining me.
It really was. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. I first want to talk about your time working with the New York Yankees. Whether you're a sports fan or not, you've probably heard of the New York Yankees. I would say that their logo is probably the most famous logo all around the world. Such a premier organization, and you got a chance to work with them for a few years. When you look back on that time in your life, Lauren, what were some of the major lessons that you pull out now that it's been a few years? What were some of the main lessons you pulled out from the New York Yankees?
Ooh, we're just diving in. I like
Let's
it.
go.
I like it. Man, I think just because this is top of mind, I had somebody ask me the other day, they said, what is the worst mental skill? And I stopped and I thought about it. And I said, I think the worst mental skill is a forced one. It's one that is not agreed upon. It is one that is, it's like, have you ever seen a good friend that you love dearly and you can tell that they're in a bad relationship or a bad situation, but they just don't see it? And no matter what you tell them, they have to come to that realization themselves. And it's no different when it comes to the mental side. It's one of those things where you have to let it come to you. Like, they have to be in agreement. It doesn't mean you can't point something out. It doesn't mean you can't challenge their current way of doing things, but that all is very dependent too on the relationship that you have with them. And I had a situation, I'll tell you this quick story. At the Yankees, we used to give these the intake forms whenever we'd have somebody come in, be it like a trade or a new draft pick. And I was meeting with this player, and it would kind of guide our first, interaction with him. So I'm sitting down and I pull out his intake form, and he goes, I'm going to stop you right there. And I said, all right. I'm like, what do you got? He said, I filled that out out of courtesy. I said, all right. So do you want to go over it? He said, no. So I literally just ripped it in half, crumbled it in a ball, and I threw it in the trash. And I said, you got me for 30 minutes. Is there anything you want to talk about? And he just dove into it. He explained why his hesitancy is the fact that he's only had bad experience with people in the mental performance field. He explained to me that his dad had stage 4 cancer, that he was currently shopping for a ring for his girlfriend, who he was completely in love with. And we had just this very human conversation that had absolutely nothing to do with mental performance. And it probably wasn't until year 2, maybe even beginning of year 3, working with him, or at least working with him is maybe the wrong term, because we weren't working on mental performance, but maybe 2 years of building a relationship, that he finally came to me and said, hey, what do you got on this mental stuff? And then we dove in. And since then, we're still in contact. Since then, he is all in on the mental game, but it took him coming to me on his own terms and in his own time that I felt it was I think anything before that would have just would have been pointless.
So it sounds like one of the words you pulled out there was ego, and we're talking about guys that are some of the best athletes in the world. I'm curious. I have a couple questions here, but what are your thoughts, Lauren, on for mental performance coaches or just coaches in general? How do we deal with the ego of being the best in the world, and you're trying to get this message across, but their ego is so big they have a hard time fitting through the door? What's the advice there?
I love this question because I think that there's two sides of it, right? I remember so part of my job at the Yankees is I assisted in the amateur scouting department. So I would go around and interview who they thought were the best of the best in the amateur draft. And I remember talking to a couple scouts, and they're like, well, here's the thing, we don't want humble Henry on the mound, we don't want somebody, we'd have players and, with the best of intentions be like, I really love charity. I'm like, no offense, but if I go to my scouting director with that, he's not going to care. That's great. We're glad you like that. That's amazing. He'd probably want you to marry his daughter, but he doesn't really want you or that. He doesn't care about that. And in the playoffs, he doesn't care. He wants to know that you're going to be able to get up there and get the job done. And so I think that part of ego can be really good if channeled in the proper direction. I think where ego can get in the way is that ego can create blind spots. It can give us this false sense of awareness. And what I find that a lot of, and I mean, we all have egos, by the way. So when I speak to this, I also recognize that I have one myself. And therefore, I also have blind spots. And I have people around me that I rely on, to be able to tell me those things. And if I ask, like, hey, how did that come off? That they'll be willing to share that. But that's important to note that we all have them. But I think where ego can get in the way is when we're afraid to accept a reality that we're not familiar with. So when somebody brings up something to us, like, hey, did you see how that came off? I don't think that came off the way you intended. Or do you know that the impact that had when you said that, or when you did that, or when you didn't do that? And so I think that it can be the thing that limits us when we're not open to alternative perspectives. And I will also say that I believe it's a muscle that has to be exercised. Because to say somebody with a big ego, like you're expecting them to suddenly accept a different reality than they're used to seeing when they look in the mirror, I think is unfair. I think it's something that has to be exercised over time. And one of the ways I like to view this is the intention impact gap. A lot of times you'll notice people that do have an ego that's getting in the way, they will explain away because they had good intentions. And there's the difference between intention and impact. You may have intended to be helpful, but actually what you did was kind of hurtful. You may have intended to share a really important piece of information, but actually you completely embarrassed that person because you didn't consider who they were around. And so when we can stop and look at those two things can be separate, and just because you have a good intention doesn't mean that the impact wasn't maybe harmful, hurtful, or maybe just the wrong kind of impact you were intending to make.
Talk to me about the line, Lauren, between wanting to help the athlete out and chasing them around. So what I'm thinking is like, in a relationship, you never want to be with somebody who doesn't want to be with you, right? We don't want that. So as a mental performance coach, where do you draw the line, or just a coach in general, where do you draw the line of, if there is a line, I want to help these kids out or this specific kid out, but he or she is either not ready, doesn't want it. How do you set that boundary for yourself? Are you following me on that question? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's interesting. It's a really good question. And I don't know if I have a definitive answer. It's kind of one of those things situationally, like I know it when I see it.
Mm.
And I'll give you a good example of it. I was another player from the Yankees. He was a new draft pick. He was really young, out of high school. I think he was 17 out of high school. Excuse me. And he was like the guy, right? Like in high school, he was the guy. Like he'd always just absolutely crush like every game, pitcher. And he came to spring training just like newly drafted, and he's pitching against like AA and AAA hitters. Now, the pitching coaches knew what they were doing. Okay. They were putting him in a situation where they knew he was going to fail, because you can't make any mistakes against those kind of hitters, especially at that level, and not expect to get exploited. And so that's what was happening. Like they just absolutely annihilated him. I mean, like he barely walked off with any dignity left. Like it was the first time he had experienced failure. They took him off. And not only that, but like the biggest stage he's ever been on. So it was tough. It would be tough for anyone, but it was really tough for him. So game ended. I'm in my office and he comes back and he is like distraught. He's like, well, I don't know what happened out there. I just like, what happened? Like, did you see that? Like, Lauren, help. And I just said, okay. I was like, well, first sit down. And I was like, all right, so here's my question. I said, like, well, how about we just start by walking through it? Like, let's revisit it. And he's like, I was like, what happened? And he like couldn't remember. It's like one of those experiences, if you, excuse me, if you've ever had them, where your mind is spinning so fast that you kind of forget in the moment. It's like you almost like black out in the moment. So he had like no memory of what happened. And So I said, that's okay. So what I want you to do, and I gave him a set of 3 questions and to go watch his video, to go watch his like film back. And I'm like, these are the questions I want you to ask yourself. And at the end of it, like, if you're not aware on the mound, let's start by bringing awareness off of it. And then little by little, you'll start to notice we'll close the gap between awareness. And soon you will be aware in the moment. So we had him start doing these journaling exercises. Well, the next day, I'm in the cafeteria line. Again, mind you, this is spring training. Everybody's here, right? It's the cafeteria is packed. Like I'm in line and I have like some of our like AAA guys in front of me. And he yells from the back of the line and he goes, "Hey, Lauren." And everyone turns around, of course. He goes, "I did my journal exercises." And like, where everyone's kind of chuckling a little bit. I'm like, that's awesome. Like, that's great. And then he stops and he goes, "Ha, just kidding." And I swear that cafeteria was silent. And I just turned around and I kept building, my plate, and I kept, whatever. I sit down, I finish eating, I go to my office and I text him and I said, "Hey, don't worry about the journal exercises." And within like 2 minutes, he like runs back to my office and he's like, "Lauren, what do you mean?" And I said, I don't think you realize is that I'm not your mom. I'm not your teacher. I'm not your friend. I said, I'm your mental performance coach. It is not my job to make sure you get your homework done. I said, if you don't want to do it, please don't do it. But I'm certainly not going to hold your hand through it. If you want support, I'm happy to support you, but I'm not going to force you to do something that ultimately you don't find value in, because that's not going to be beneficial to you or me. You're going to waste my time and you're going to waste yours. And he's like, oh, okay. Like, no, I'll do it. I'll do it for you. And I said, no, so you're still not getting it. I said, I go to sleep the same, whether or not you choose to do your journal exercises. And I will wake up and do my job at a high level the next day, regardless if you do your journal exercises. I said, no one can improve your ability to perform but you. So unless you choose to do it for yourself, please don't do it for me. And he stopped and he's like, I understand. And he walked away. And that evening, I received a photo of his first journal entry. And after every outing he had, or bullpen, I got another journal entry. And I still get a call every spring training from him. And he became one of the best in terms of buy-in with the mental performance, the mental game within our system as the new draft pick that year. And in that situation, I knew exactly what to do because I recognized it. He was doing it for me. He was doing it because he thought that was what they wanted. That was what the Yankees wanted from him, not recognizing that as an athlete, whether you're an athlete, a business professional, or an individual, the responsibility is yours. It's nobody else's. I'm here to support and guide you as much or as little as you want, but I can't do the work for you. So when you step out on that field, you have to be okay with the work that you put into it. When you lay your head on the pillow at night, you have to be willing to go, you know what, I did everything in my power. And whether or not that includes mental performance, that's totally up to you. But I recognize that at that moment, he was doing it for the wrong reasons. And so that was a very easy and clear boundary for me to set.
What a great story. And a seasoned coach like you, Lauren, you one of the world's best, you were able to use your experience by putting down the law and saying this is having that tough conversation, right? But the beginner coach, the novice coach, they might want to keep chasing, keep doing this, keep doing that. I want you to, hey, are you checking in doing there? You're saying you sleep the same no matter what. Some of the younger coaches, they might be losing sleep over the kids aren't doing this, they're not following this, or this one kid's not they're just not grabbing onto what I'm saying. There's this principle that gets floated around a lot of 10-80-10, right? 10% of them are going to be above and beyond. They're going to do everything you say and they're going to ask you for more. 80% are going to kind of float in between. And there's going to be 10% at the bottom. I think for coaches out there, and tell me if you agree or disagree, sometimes going into a situation when you're working with a team is just understanding, plain and simple, 10, 80, 10. There's going to be 10 that is just going to be the way they freaking are. And they're going to bug you and they're not going to do your journals. They're not going to do that stuff. And your goal is to just try to bring them to the 80. Don't bring the 10 at the bottom end all the way to the 10 at the upper end. But having that framework can be really helpful for a younger coach who's trying to do so much in a little bit amount of time. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that your earlier question around ego connects very well to it. Um, and I will speak for myself here. I'm right out of grad school. Man, I can look back. I wouldn't have thought it then, but I can look back and go, man, I had a big ego. I was like, here I am to come save everybody. And it's like, no, absolutely not. How foolish of me to think that. But it's not to say I didn't have good things to share, but how foolish of me to think that it was my responsibility to change and improve other people. No, it's my responsibility to show up, to serve. Sometimes that means sharing. Sometimes that just means listening. And I think as a new practitioner, I so badly wanted to help, right? It's not because of bad intentions. It's very good intentions. But when I recognized that actually I was not helping, right? There's that intention impact gap. When I was forcing, I actually wasn't helping anybody. I was actually pushing them further away. And so what I realized that when I lead with curiosity, and instead of going like, why, no, this is what you need to do. Like, look, this is why. And like, you're just trying to like give proof and evidence and all that. And you start to lead with more questions and you're a little bit more curious as to, okay, well, tell me more about that. Because when you begin to understand, you can navigate it a little bit better. Now, it doesn't always mean you get to the finish line the way that you want to. But it's, again, when we're there to serve, it's not about you. It's about how can I show up? And I recognize that sometimes some of my guys, they just wanted to talk about the problems with their girlfriend. Like, they're like, Lauren, I can't talk to any of my guys about this. Like, I don't want to talk to them about this. Like, I just play big sister sometimes. And then sometimes it was like, hey, things aren't good at home. All right, let's talk about that. And then, hey, I'm feeling depressed. Like, I'm not there to solve that, but hey, let me get you the resources that you need for that. And I would make sure to get them, they're a clinical resource that can help them. So I just think that, to your point, there's a great analogy that James Clear uses. And he says, there's two ways to get water out of a hose when it's kinked. You can turn up the hose and force the water out, or you can go find the kink and remove it. And I think that when you're young and you're new to the field and inexperienced, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, I've started by forcing water out. But as I gained experience, I started to learn that actually the best way for water to flow through in a sustainable manner, and in a way that is helpful to both parties, is to go and find the kink and remove it. So I think that's the best way I can.
That's great. You're on fire. You have a quote that I just love. I want to dive into a little bit more. It's you become elite by choice, not by chance. Knowing what to do is not enough. What separates the average from the elite is the choices that they make. We've talked a lot on the show about habits and setting yourself up well, but I haven't heard it like the way you do, and I love it. The choices. So I really want to dive deeper into that word. So once again, you become elite by choice, not by chance. Can you talk on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I have so many inspirations in my life, and one of them we talked about earlier, who's now is like a really good friend of mine, but Justin Sua, and I know you've had him on this podcast a lot. He was my first mentor back in 2013, and now just a really good friend. And I remember he and I had a conversation, and we were just talking about like if you could boil down mental performance, what would it look like? And I went all the way down, like, what is the difference maker? Like, yes, how we think it impacts our choices. But sometimes the way that we're thinking, like you could be thinking something and still choose different. And so I kind of got to this point, like, well, is choice dependent on thought? And I'm like, not necessarily. because there are times where I'm really angry. Like, right. I'm really angry. I'm really frustrated. And all I want to do is rip up the paper in front of me. But instead, I just put it to the side and continue a conversation, or I choose to leave the room, So choices aren't always dependent on how we feel. They're not always dependent on the thoughts that come to mind, but choice can be independent of those things. And when I realized the actual difference maker comes down to actions, and how do we make actions? Or how do actions unfold, I should say. They unfold through choices, and their choices moment to moment. And so what I realized is that what elite performers do really well is they're really intentional with the choices they make. And excuse me, fighting a little cough here. They're really intentional with the choices that they make. And so whether it be a choice as simple as, water versus soda, a choice as simple as meditating versus not, a choice as simple as scrolling Instagram or going for a walk. And these are very simple choices, of course, but what we recognize is sometimes we put so much weight into big decisions, and we fail to recognize how compounding little decisions become. And so I do think that that's where there's a separator, and it's being able to recognize how important each choice that you make is. It doesn't mean every single choice needs to be thought through for several minutes, that can cause paralysis, right? But it's not letting choices go by without considering their impact.
Yeah. You and I both have a shared love and passion for Justin Sue and also James Clear. And one of James Clear's, one of my favorite quotes of all time is when James says, every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Every action you take is a vote. And this is constantly in my head, by the way. I'm always thinking about, when you're voting for somebody, it's not one vote that's going to elect somebody president, or for example, it's the culmination, the compounding of these votes. What I like a lot about your quote, is that it's by choice. It gives you a sense of empowerment. I'm not born this way. That's not is or isn't. I have the choice to be great. I also have the choice every day to make choices, right? So talk to me a little bit about the empowerment of, you get to choose this life and you get to choose how you feel. I like to say, act different than how you feel. You feel nervous, act differently. You want to feel confident, act confidently. This fires me up. Talk to me a little bit about that a little bit more.
Oof, I love this. I actually reminds me of a story of a golfer I was working with. I was on the course doing just observation. I was just watching his round, and at the end of the round ended earlier than it needed to. And what happened is, if you've ever watched golf and you've seen, you can visually see golfers begin to get frustrated, and it starts to add up with each putt or each swing. And so I'm watching him, and I'm like, he's not in a good space. He's getting more and more frustrated. And then he misses he three putts for double bogey, and he's really upset, throws down his club, runs to his bag, grabs his driver, pretty much runs to the next tee. I had to jog to keep up with him. Puts down his ball, completely ignores his pre-shot routine and just swings. And we watch as his ball flies directly into a hazard. And he's so frustrated that he walks off, throws his club, and just quits. And I nobody wants to be talked to when they're that upset. So I let his emotions die down. And then we met for dinner later that night. And I asked him, I said, what happened out there? And he said, he's like, Lauren, you don't understand. I don't like to lose. That's just who I am. I said, oh, hold on to there a second. He said, no, that's not who you are. That's who you're choosing to be. It's okay to be frustrated. It's not okay to lose your cool. It's okay to experience fear. It's not okay to allow fear to take the wheel. It's okay to be mad. It's not okay to throw your club at your caddy. And so I was like, I just need you to recognize that your feelings are valid. The actions you took are not in alignment with who I know you want to be. So there's a difference. It's not who you are. It's who you are choosing to be. And when you can shift that language, you suddenly shift responsibility. And that's where empowerment comes from. We give away our power when we give away responsibility to things outside of us. And so I think that, we always have a choice, but sometimes it can be forgotten. And you may not have a choice of the circumstance that you're in, but you do have a choice in how you choose to look at it. You may not have a choice with how somebody spoke to you, but you do have a choice to look at it and go, where might that be coming from? And so I think that it's not to say it's easy, right? There's a lot of times I even struggle with this, but we always have a choice in the matter. And so when I look at this and what you had mentioned is like, hey, if you're not feeling, you don't have to feel confident to look confident. And so I always say, don't fake it till you make it. Learn to behave it regardless of how you feel. Because if our actions are dependent on our feelings or our thoughts, they will always become a victim of them. And so I do just think that when we can give ourselves the choice back, we empower ourselves to look at alternative options rather than just our default setting.
In a recent podcast, the gal I was interviewing was telling me this quote. I can't get out of my head because it's so good. It says, what follows I am follows you. And I was like, wow, that's so true, right? So I go back to, we're just talking about a little bit of language here. And to most people, it's like, hey, what's the big deal? Like if I say I am angry, like what's the big deal? But what if it was, instead of the athlete, I am angry? What if it's I'm feeling anger? Are we saying, Lauren, that just putting in one word of this is how you're feeling rather than I am blank can somehow have some separation in identity of who you are, and for the positive either, like I am nervous. I'm feeling nervous. Is this kind of what you're saying, that sometimes putting that one word can help separate the identity?
Yes, absolutely. And what you're referring to is actually Dan Siegel's work, which is Name It to Tame It. And it's this
Mm,
idea that when you can name your emotions, and not that I am angry, it's I am feeling angry. And so what you're doing is you're actually distancing yourself from the emotion you're feeling rather than identifying with it. And so your brain will love it, because what you do when you do this is you send soothing neurotransmitters to the emotional centers of your brain. And it allows you to it's almost like it's really hard to see your next step on a map when it's an inch from your face. But when you distance yourself from it, you're suddenly able to see the full picture. And so this is what we're doing from a mental perspective when it comes to emotions. Instead of being an inch away from our map, the map of our emotions, we're able to zoom out and go, okay, this is not what I am. This is what I'm feeling. And what I know about feelings is that they're always temporary. And so what is the next best step that I can take, even even while I'm feeling this way? And I'll tell you, there's a question. I like to ask a lot of questions. And there's this one particular question my husband asked me one day, and he loves that I give him credit for this because he likes to remind me that he was the one that asked me this question. But I have to give credit where credit is due. It is by far like one of the most impactful questions that for myself that I use often. And one day I got a really bad email. I was so frustrated. I wanted to like throw my computer out the window, and I'm venting to him. I'm like, this is crap. I'm so frustrated. Like I'm offended, like that they would even think that, like, or they would, all this stuff. So I'm like going on this rant, and he stops me and he said, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure. He said, what typically helps in moments like these? That question like stopped me in my tracks. And again, this is another form of distancing. And what it did is it made me zoom out, look at the bigger map, and go find other times when I had been in this situation and think through what response was helpful and maybe what wasn't. And immediately I said, not responding, giving myself 24 hours and coming back once the emotion is passed. And he said, just curious. I was like, you I like a little piece of me was like so mad how right he was. I was like, but thank you. And so I offer that question to everybody listening too. Um, when you're feeling some intense emotions, you can use distancing not only by naming how you feel, but by also asking yourself a simple question such as that one, what typically helps in moments like these?
You have another phenomenal quote that I think I saw on your website. I'd love for you to unpack it. Everyone wants the privilege of being great. Few people want the responsibilities of it. That's fire. Can you talk to me about it?
Yeah, it's a quote that whenever I hear it or say it, it reminds me of my grandfather. Um, my grandfather was a horse racing steward. And what that means, he was like the referee of horse racing. So like the big horse racing, I don't even know, like stadiums, I don't know what you call them, all throughout California. That's what my husband or my grandfather used to work at, like so Santa Anita, Los Angeles, like Carlsbad, all those. He used to, or Del Mar, he used to, be a ref at. And we would go as kids to like go watch, their horse races. I love them. And my mom told me this story. She said that when she was younger, they lived in Long Beach and he was working in San Diego at the time. So it was several hours away. And he would drive, 3+ hours a day or I forget how long it was, but we'll just say 3 for the sake of the story, 3 hours to there and back every day. And my mom said, she's like, one day he comes home and we're sitting around the dinner table. And I asked him, I said, do you like driving in traffic? And he just kind of chuckles. He's like, no, why do you ask that? And she said, because you never complain. Like every day you sit in traffic going to and from work for hours at a time. And I never hear you complain about it. And he said, well, that's because I signed on the line. And she's like, what do you mean? He said, when I signed up for this job, I signed up for all that was required. One of those things being having to sit in traffic every day for multiple hours at a time. And so when I heard this story, immediately I thought, when you sign up for your goals, when you sign up for your dreams, when you sign up for any big journey that you're after, you sign up for all that comes with it. And so the question becomes, are you willing to live the lifestyle required to achieve the things that you want? And I find that there's a lot of people that don't think about it before they sign up for it. And so they all want the benefits of being great, but they don't want all the things that are required of it. And so whenever I'm working with somebody and we're going through, like, what is it that you want? So that's a tough question to answer. I'm also making sure that they know what they're signing up for, because to be great, you've got to, I mean, there's sacrifices, there are big things, and it's not for everyone, and that's okay. But before you sign up for anything big, ask yourself the question, am I willing to live the lifestyle required to achieve that thing that I so desperately want?
It's another great story. You're full of great stories. I think another add on to that, there's a book that totally changed my life. It's called The Coaching Habit by Michael Bungay Stainer. He's been on my show once before. It's an unbelievable book about asking questions. He's got these 7 questions that he likes to ask. And one of the questions is very pivotal. It's, if you're saying yes to this, what are you saying no to? And after listening to you and Justin for several hours the last couple of days, one of the things I picked up from you guys is the contrast principle. So talking about all the things that you want, yes, but sometimes what can be great is asking the opposite questions about, well, what doesn't it look like? So if you are signing up for a marathon, right? The Twin Cities Marathon just happened, so it's kind of top of mind. If you want to sign up for a marathon next year, what are you saying yes to? Right, the marathon and the training, but then what are you saying no to? I'm probably saying no to some Saturday night drinking or staying up. Right, get both sides of the equation. I kind of laid it out there. Can you fill in the gaps on the contrast principle for my listeners?
Well, I think you explained it very well. I think it's this idea that sometimes it's easier to explain what you don't want than what you do. So a lot of times I run into this with a lot of my clients where I say, all right, well, tell me, like, what do you want? And that's a really hard question for people to answer. And so then I say, okay, well, let's start with this one. What don't you want? And that helps with clarity. I also find that helps with revealing blind spots and plans. Like, okay, what is my plan to do this? Okay, what could go wrong? And so I do think that contrasting those things not only helps us see more of a 360 view of whatever we're looking at, but it can also provide a lot of clarity and reveal blind spots. And so there's a great principle called the survivorship bias. And I love this principle because I think it explains this very, very well. And essentially in World War II, the US was in trouble. Their planes were coming back riddled with bullet holes, and they realized we need to reinforce our planes. So what they started doing is they plotted all the bullet holes on the planes. And then they were like, all right, where should we reinforce them? Because we need to think about this in two ways. Is one, we need to reinforce them enough to where our planes are protected, but we don't want to reinforce them too much to where it ruins maneuverability. And now we're like wasting a lot. We need a lot more fuel to fly them because they're heavier. And a mathematician by the name of Abraham Wald actually said, you're making a big mistake by doing that. And they were like, why is that? He said, because you're only considering the planes that survived, not the planes that didn't. And so I thought that was so fascinating because it just shows this blind spot. And I find that a lot of whether you're an athlete, a business professional, or otherwise, a lot of times we focus on the things that made it, that have survived, whether it's a client, whether it's a skill, whether it's a position, excuse me, a process or a strategy. We focus on the things that worked and we fail to look at the things that didn't. And so that's why, and I know Justin feels the same way about this, but that's why I hate that phrase, win or lose. It's no, win or lose, you, or win or lose, or you win or you learn, that thing. It's like, no, win or lose, you learn, because you need to be looking at both sides of the coin. And so I do think that the contrasting principle, by asking the opposite, okay, if this is what I see, what might I be missing? Those kind of questions really help to challenge our default setting, because our default is rarely accurate. And so if you've ever seen people in a room that are the last to speak, pay attention to those people, because often the first to speak, it doesn't mean they don't have a good answer or a good thought, but oftentimes they've had thought through the entire problem. And so I think that these posing questions in opposites and contrasting ways help us to do that.
Phenomenal. As I was preparing for this conversation today, going through all your podcasts and everything else on your website, one of the things I found was a document that was titled 57 Powerful Mental Performance Questions. And for listeners out there, if you want to get the whole list, I'd highly recommend it. The byline of this show, Lauren, is Get Curious. I'm just such a believer. All my shirts say Get Curious on the back. I'm having something made back here that's going to be called Get Curious. I believe the curiosity is a superpower for self growth. And in order to have curiosity, I think one of the fundamentals is being able to ask questions. And you have 57 of them. And we're not going to go through all 57. I want you guys to go do that on your own. But the way you break it down from a mindset standpoint is also something I haven't seen before. So you have 5 different kind of pillars, if you will: your relationship with yourself, your relationship with problems, your inner circle, your tendencies, and the post-game review. I've never seen it mapped like that. I love it. I would love to go through, if we could just pull out, Lauren, one question from each one as we close down. So the first one is your relationship with yourself. You say on the document, the relationship you have with yourself is hands down the most important relationship you'll ever be in. What's your favorite question to improve your relationship with yourself?
It's probably the first one, which is, how do you describe you to yourself? That tells you a lot about your relationship with you. And it's not necessarily if I ask you that question right now, it's not necessarily that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to go into your archives. And when you're around friends, do you shrink when you describe yourself and what you're doing and the path you're on to others? Do you beat yourself up every single time things don't go exactly the way you want them to? Do you describe yourself powerfully? Do you describe yourself as somebody that's just okay and average? And I think that there's a balance, right? between humility and arrogance, right? There is some sort of balance. And I remember I was actually, I was speaking to a very, very high up executive, and I thought it was fascinating. He was an executive of a sports organization. And one of the players said, what do we say when people say, do you expect yourself to win? And he said, she essentially said, like, I don't know how to respond to that, because I don't want to sound like arrogant. And he goes, to you say, hell yeah, I'm going to win. To everybody else, you say, we're going to put our best foot forward, but we'll see. And I loved that, because he's like, the way that you say it to yourself doesn't always have to be an outward expression. And so I do think that when the way that you describe you to yourself is so powerful, because I really believe that becomes the lens in which we make decisions. And I think that's really hard to outperform your own belief about you.
Yeah, so cool. There's a great story. I'll just share it really quick. But way back in the day, William James, famous psychologist, he hosted this huge conference, right? And all these people came from all over the country to hear William James speak. And everybody gets there, and the person that's announcing him goes through all his accolades, and the accolades took like 20 minutes. And everybody's like, man, let's go. I want to hear what William James has to say. And he comes up on the stage and he grabs the mic and he said, what I've learned in my time of being a psychologist is this: people by and large become what they think of themselves. Put the mic back on the stand. He walked out. People went nuts. Some people were like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. Give me a pen. I got to write this down. Other people are like, what the hell? I wasted time to get here. I can't believe this is all I got, right? I only got this one sentence. But I think this is what we're talking about here, right? How do you describe yourself? People by and large become what they think of themselves.
Yes. Oh, that is so good. I just got chilled. I wish I was in that room.
Oh, good. Let's go to number two. So number two is your relationship with problems. You say that you can't avoid problems, but you can avoid your relationship with them. What's your favorite question for improving your relationship with problems, Lauren?
I mean, I think it's funny. I mean, there's several of them that I like, but I think that they kind of go in order. And so I think that you can't really answer the ones at the bottom without answering the ones at the top. And I think so that the first one is, what is your current relationship with your problems? And I think that sometimes this is a different concept. It's a different way of thinking about the problems that you have in front of you. And so I think that's why I like this question, is because people go, what do you mean by that? Well, I always describe your relationship like, have you ever been like, you're in a grocery store and you see somebody from like high school that like you never want to see and you don't want to run into and you don't want to stop and have a conversation with. So suddenly you need kale, and you've never eaten kale. You actually don't like kale, but suddenly you're in the kale aisle and you're going to buy it just to avoid a conversation with that person. And then there's somebody where it's a good friend of yours and you see them and you're like, no way. And you run up and you're like, oh God, you give them a hug. And then there's somebody where you see them and you're like, oh my God, I haven't talked to that person in so long. It's good to see you. It's not as exciting. And so I'm like, that's how I look at problems. Like, what is your relationship with fear? Is your relationship with fear something that like when you see it, you like avoid it at all costs? Are you somebody that's like, you know what, hell yeah, let's go. Like, I'm ready for this challenge. Or are you somebody that's like, I'm not so sure. I'm kind of like somewhere in the middle. And so when we identify like where we are in response to our problems, I think it really helps us to go, oh, when we look at it as a relationship, it makes it so that we can go, oh, it's something we can improve. And how do you improve relationships? Consistency, spending time with that thing, and sometimes being willing to have difficult conversations with it. So it's like the people you are closest with, you are around, you have likely had difficult conversations with, you don't run away from when there's problems. You're willing to sit in the discomfort with them because you love them more than you care about the problem. So I think that when we look at your relationship with problems, I like to look at it very similarly to how we have a relationship with other people.
Love that. Great analogy. Your third pillar, your inner circle. You say who you surround yourself with really matters. What's the question to improve or to be aware of your inner circle, Lauren?
I think that I love number 5, which is, do the people in your inner circle collaborate with you or compete with you?
Mm.
And I think this is top of mind for me because I think, in the field of mental performance, I think that it's super easy to compare yourself to others, right? It's so easy to go like, oh, that person's working with that person or that person's doing that. Like that's and comparing. But I just think, like anything, that there is room. There's enough success to go around. There's room for everybody in that way. And so I truly believe that you actually get a whole lot more, not just success, but I think you get a whole lot more fulfillment and relationships when you look at it as a collab. How can I collaborate with this person? What can I learn from that person? Because when you shift your perspective just slightly, it's no longer like they're taking from you. It's like, what can I gain? And then what might I be able to give and support? Like, how can I give? It's not always a take, right? It's like sometimes when you're so down on yourself, one of the best things to do is ask yourself, how can I serve others? Because by the act of giving is there's this reciprocation of like that is incredible. It's like sometimes hard to describe. So I really like this because I think that it doesn't mean that competition is not important, that you can't have a healthy competition. It doesn't mean that. But I think that sometimes when we're the people who we surround ourselves with, if we're constantly in competition, I find that there's a toxicity that is associated with it.
Yeah, reminds me of Kara Dweck's work when she talks about fix versus growth. So the fixed mindset, they get threatened by other people's success, if I'm quoting her correctly. And then the growth mindset is more, they see inspiration. So do you feel threatened by people's success, or do you seek more, hey, that's inspiring, I want to be more like that? I think that's phenomenal. Number four, the fourth pill is your tendencies. The quote from Aristotle is phenomenal. It says, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. What's the question to improve your tendencies?
Um, I like this number 9, which is, do you make excuses when you don't do the things you said you were going to do? Um, I think it's important because when it comes to tendencies, I think looking yourself in the mirror is one of the most beneficial things you can do. And I think that if you really want the truth, I think that you ask yourself this question, you sit in silence for a couple minutes and see what comes to mind, with the sole purpose of telling yourself, all I want is honesty. Because you can't lie to yourself. And so I really like that question because I think that when it comes to tendencies, when you can be honest and reveal your own excuses to yourself, you've got some really, really great potential ahead of you.
Love it. The last one is the post-game review. How you leave one season often determines how you enter into the next. I would say also from a practice standpoint, from practice to practice, game to game, how you leave one sometimes how you enter into the other one. What's the question there?
I think that all of these are really important, but I think one of the post game reviews that I think is important because I think it's often forgotten is number 6, which is, why did you start this journey in the first place? Whether things are good or bad, I think that one of the things that we forget along the way is why we did it, why we started. I think when you can reconnect to that, um, you can often like reconnect to like, what do I want to do next? Like, I think it's a helpful guiding light in terms of action. So I really like that question.
Cool. All right, let's finish. Just go through them really quick. The first one was a relationship with yourself. Your question was,
Oh, let me go back up because there's so many of them. How do you describe yourself to you?
how do you describe yourself to you? And then the second one, your relationship with your problems. The best question is,
What is your current relationship with your problems?
the third one is about improving your inner circle. And the question is,
Do the people in your inner circle collaborate with you or compete with you?
and the fourth one, your tendencies. How do we improve our tendencies?
Do you make excuses when you don't do the things you said you were going to do?
And you finished with an awesome one, the post game review. The question we need to ask ourselves is,
Why did you start this journey in the first place?
awesome. Lauren, this was phenomenal. I appreciate it. Every single minute went by so fast. I feel like we could talk for hours. For my listeners out there, how can they best support you? And the stage is yours.
Oh my gosh, support me. And more so the question is, how can I support you? I can't thank you enough for having me. And I guess if I can support any of our listeners in any way, you can find me on most social media channels. But the best way to find me is my website, which is laurenjohnsonandco.com. And that's all spelled out ANDCO.com.
Lauren, thanks for your time. Thanks for your wisdom.
Thank you.